This is the Seahawkers podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Schultz, and it is the off season. We're getting into draft season, and we're getting into guest season, and we're starting things off with Mr. Dan Viens of the Seahawks Forever podcast. Also, The Pick is in podcast. Also, Clinton Bonner joining me. But Dan, how you doing, man?
I'm good. Happy 10th anniversary of the Packers NFC Championship game, right? Today. 10 years ago today. It's good to see you guys. It's been a minute.
One of the greatest comebacks in our Seahawks history. It's amazing to think that it's been 10 years. How do you remember that moment, Clinton, of the comeback against the Packers? It seemed like such a dismal time because there were such high expectations for the team. They get off well. Richard Sherman had an interception in that game that kind of, got you fired up.
Great.
And then the offense did almost nothing. Clinton, what do you remember about that?
There's one lasting memory that is not even part of the game, and it's just cemented there. And it comes from Twitter, actually. So decade old ago Twitter. And it is after the game, Michael Bennett is riding around in the bike that he had, and they're waving to the fans. And then somebody on Twitter superimposed a basket in front of it and put Earl Thomas as if he was E.T. in the front of the bike basket. And it was just the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life. And it made like the moment, like that night, you can't go to bed. So you're just firing through everything else. And I see that moment of Bennett on a bike with Earl Thomas playing the role of E.T. after what was the most improbable comeback in our history. So happy 10th anniversary to you as well.
That was great. I have a quick story about that. Yeah.
Okay. I was going to say, because you live in the area, I was curious if you were at that game.
Live in the area, lifetime season ticket holder at the game. But that game was a life lesson for me. There have been 3 times in my Seahawks life that I have kind of left the stadium a little bit early to like beat traffic or whatever. All 3 times were, I'm a person that likes to take accountability, but all 3 times occurred with someone that I used to share my life with, and they always wanted to get home before the traffic left. All right. Those 3 times were the Fail Mary. There was a regular season comeback against the Houston Texans where Seahawks went right down the field, touchdown to Jimmy Graham. Don't know if you remember that one. And then it was this game. And all 3 times I watched the end of all 3 of those games, including this NFC Championship game against Packers, from the exact same TV at the exact same concession spot on the way out, like as we're leaving. So between the time we left our seats and went down to the 100 level, we had recovered the onside kick and, oh my God, there's a chance. And so even though we were in the stadium, I watched that moment happen on a concession stand screen. And then I heard, obviously the crowd and everything else. And then the other people that were out on the concourse at the moment, total strangers, we all start hugging each other. Like to go so quickly from, well, I guess we're not going to go back to the Super Bowl. We were so close to the reality. And I love to call, that was it, oh my gosh. Was it Buck? Was it Joe Buck?
Yeah, it must have been Joe Buck. It was Fox, right? So
and he was like, as soon as Curse catches the ball, he's like, the Seahawks are going back to the Super Bowl. It was like that reality setting in. It was an incredible moment.
It was a fun moment.
I never left the game early again after that.
I have only left early once, but I haven't attended as many times as you have. One was 2010, because it was Charlie Whitehurst quarterbacking. Was it 2011? It was right in there, and they were down, I think, 30-0 against the Giants at halftime. And I was at that NFC Championship game, and I had several friends around us who left early because, well, one of the people in their party had already fallen over some chairs, and she probably needed to go home a little early. So.
Hey, watching all those picks from Russ that day and some of the drops, I think I had a couple extra too.
Yeah, things off with shoulder blades and the rest. I guess the only question I have, I'm proud of you, Dan, that you've never left again. However, I'm a little bit like perplexed that you haven't asked ownership, like, can you get season tickets at that TV? Like whatever that TV concession was, you'd be like, could you just write him in? Like, hey, here's the story behind this TV and me. I just think you deserve a seat right there. And then we don't lose, Dan. This is pretty
Maybe
easy.
a little name placard on the TV, like
absolutely.
the PSLs are. Yeah.
So at what point in any game does where it gets out of hand, do you go and try and find that spot? And you're like, this is the comeback spot.
It hasn't happened yet, but I need to remember that the next time the game is close. Maybe if I had gone down there for the home Rams game this year or the Giants game,
maybe the Bills game, they come back.
We might be talking about a playoff appearance right now. Yeah, it's on me, guys. Sorry.
Oh well, now we know who to blame. Now we know who to blame for our offensive coordinator search. Things may have gone differently.
Sorry, Ryan.
Maybe Ryan Grubb wouldn't be looking for a job. But we do have some news this week of candidates getting a second interview. Grant Udinski coming in for a second interview. You've got Clint Kubiak coming in for a second interview. And then we have a new name emerging, Dan, which Byron Leftwich coming in and interviewing. Any of these candidates standing out to you so far?
It might be the most diverse and interesting coordinator search I've ever seen. Usually when these things happen, and we've seen a couple of them over the last 10 years, all the candidates kind of line up in a certain pocket. They're very identifiable, and they're usually names that most people recognize, and they've been kicked around and, retreads and that kind of thing. There's two types of candidates you can consider for a coordinator position: those that have never done it, but you think they might be good at it, and those that have been fired somewhere else and have failed at it and are available to do it again. The Seahawks seem to have no fear in this search about kind of stepping outside of the envelope and turning over every rock and considering every possibility. I'm fascinated by the Hank Fraley idea. I'm fascinated by this Udinski kid that, I don't know, do his parents have to accompany him on the plane if he comes out here for him? Like it's remarkable to me that someone that young can be that accomplished. I mean, he's been in the league for 5 years already. And so the things you hear about him and that's fascinating. I think Clint Kubiak is about as good a candidate as you could find. And a guy that I really wanted them to consider last year, but that we had the late kind of process and he took another job. I think it's a really good group. My feelings on Leftwich, I mean, it's tough to think that a guy that's been out of the league for 2 years, it would end up being the best candidate. But you look at what he did, and not just obviously the year they won the Super Bowl in Tampa Bay, but the last year that Brady was there when he wasn't quite, the Tom Brady we recall. And they did some pretty cool things on offense. Now he doesn't have much of a history of running the ball very effectively. And so my thought is maybe, because we saw those reports, right, that Hank Fraley is reaching out to potential passing game coordinator candidates. So some of these guys that are coming in under the guise of interviewing for the coordinator job, maybe interviewing for other roles as well. And they're trying to assemble like a team, with which I would say, Leftwich, I mean, I have all the respect in the world for Bruce Arians in his passing game and some of the things that we saw him do in Arizona. And that's the tree that Leftwich learned from. So in that role, I'd be intrigued. I think it's a good group. And there's probably another name or two out there, guys that they didn't have to get permission to interview that they've talked to as well that we don't even know about. So
I think for me, the Fraley piece is interesting. And I know everybody wants what Detroit has. I get that. That's the hot thing. And we're going to watch them tonight. And everybody wants that. And I understand that. And but you have a lot of talent there as well. And things are really clicking there. I just get a little turned off, if you will, by the idea that's like, okay, we'll bring him in, but he absolutely needs a pass coordinator, where we just got done with Grubb, who never had time in the NFL, and we saw the warts there. And then to go to somebody else, whether that's Udinski or Fraley, that just hasn't done the whole package yet. And I just wonder what the temperature is. Like you're saying, hey, it seems like they're okay with it, but I don't know when the rubber meets the road, if they're just going to go with the guy that is the more complete OC, which of the pack so far, well, it's either Leftwich or Kubiak. And then I guess, so, and I also want to ask you about style-wise about Kubiak. Why do you think he, in your opinion, might be one of the more intriguing ones so far?
Because when you look at a description of his sort of base scheme principles that he believes in and that he learned from Shanahan, it looks like a checklist of what Mike Macdonald has said he wants to do, and what many of us have talked about for years that we need, especially in light of a developing, growing offensive line that needs to improve. Tons, near the top of the league in 12 and 13 personnel usage, right? His base kind of go-to in the run game is wide zone, but then he says, but then we cater to what we can do well. So it was kind of a debate all year, right? Where Grubb was sort of going back and forth, gap, wide zone, inside zone, what works, never really found that perfect sauce. Kubiak has said he sort of does the same thing, although he prefers wide zone. Much more play action than we've seen in the past. And just a lot of those qualities I think are really appealing, and there's something you look for, because as much as we've all sat here and talked about the offensive line for good reason for the last few years, and will continue to until it's fixed, there are things you can do to mitigate a struggling offensive line. And even Shane Waldron, we would at times see him do that. There were games he would go heavy 13 personnel and lean into that, help out his tackles. The Seahawks under Ryan Grubb last year, I think, I didn't see the very end of the year, but through week 16, they were like top 5 in the league in leaving their tackles on an island, tackles that are struggling. And that included the timeline where we had Stone Forsythe and Michael Jarrell out there playing before Lucas came back. And they're just leaving those guys alone. That's not how you help out a struggling line. So I think some of those philosophical things that Kubiak believes in and uses are things that we need.
Yeah, to me, he's really the only name that, if you're looking for the full package and experience, that it's all there with. And I think Leftwich has that to a certain extent. It's just that, he went from having one of the top offenses, and, they even brought in Leonard Fournette and kind of resurrected his career, and had kind of a, used him as that physical part of that Bucks offense that helped that helped the offense, that was more finesse with Brady. And then Leonard Fournette goes down that final year. Arians leaves. It kind of all crumbled in that final year. And I think between him not taking a head coaching job when it seemed like he was close to having that opportunity in Jacksonville, although reports came out a couple weeks ago that said that he was never offered the job. Because I think that was part of the
thing. Was kind of weird.
It was kind of weird, because how I remember it and the reports that came out is that he wanted the job, but he also wanted to bring his own general manager. And Trent Baalke was being considered as the general manager at that time. And so he had his own guy, which I feel like made sense, because if you're going to have that pairing, and Trent Baalke obviously has not worked out in a couple different areas. So
still there though.
He is still there, which is very interesting. So a lot of that goes into that Byron Leftwich piece. It makes him an interesting candidate, but also I don't know if that kind of candidate would be embraced as much because of the final year that he had as an offensive coordinator.
Yeah. And the one thing that Leftwich has that none of these other candidates do is he's played quarterback in the league, like at a pretty high level for a long time. And it's kind of amazing to me when you look around the league, how few of the sitting coordinators are former quarterbacks. They might've played it in high school or earlier in their college career, but most of these guys now, they're kind of football nerds in the way they're brought up, and they get into coaching really early. It's pretty remarkable to me, because you would think, as hard as it is to play that position in this sport at that level, that would kind of come in handy when it comes to trying to decide in game situations and calling plays and feeling a game and all those things that it takes to be a great play caller. But apparently it's not a prerequisite, because the best play callers in the league never set foot on an NFL field as a player.
It's interesting. It might, might be why Udinski was so interesting as well, with McCown sitting there, right? Who played 18 years, right? And they're not going for McCown. They're going for.
I'm surprised by that. Are you guys surprised by that McCown hasn't been a candidate? I mean, he's out there interviewing for head coaching jobs, for goodness sake.
I mean, I was surprised when we got a alert, hey, Udinski from the Vikings, like, okay, well, how about McCown? Because he's known as, he was always kind of known as a player coach, even throughout his career. Like, you kept him around because he could help the quarterback room, and he could help he was very cerebral, et cetera. Really understands the game. So yeah, I'm surprised by that, but who knows? So who knows what's making him tick?
Yeah.
Are you surprised at all by some other names that you haven't heard? Because one of the things that seemed very evident was how hands off of the offense, relatively, Coach Mike Macdonald was. And to not maybe bring in some more senior coaches who have been a head coach and also offensive coordinators, does it surprise you that none of those names have been among the ones we've heard?
Yeah, there's one early on that Bryce Coots turned me on to from Hawks Zone Rundown that, in trying to connect dots, listening to Mike Macdonald in his year-end press conference talk about Jim Harbaugh and his reverence for him and how he plays football, that Marcus Brady isn't a guy that got an interview. I've seen him get other interviews, but he's by title. He's Harbaugh's offensive coordinator down there, and he did call plays for a couple of years in Indianapolis through some tough years with some quarterback injuries and stuff there. Had coordinated a couple of really successful rushing offenses there with Jonathan Taylor early in his career, and he's a guy coming from that Harbaugh tree that I kind of am surprised that they didn't interview. And then I was really curious to see if they'd interview Schottenheimer, but I think that's just a case where philosophically maybe he would be a fit, but sometimes it's kind of hard to go back down that bridge again when you've been there.
I do have one more question on Kubiak for you, Dan. You mentioned earlier that Clint Kubiak, a lot of 12 personnel, a lot of 13 personnel. So in some ways it puts more emphasis on who your two receivers are because they're on the field while as opposed to 11 personnel, of course, with 3 out there. So what do you think with DK Metcalf? A lot of different talk out there. What should we do with DK going into his last year? How do you roster construct, et cetera, et cetera? If someone like Clint Kubiak is the choice, what do you think that signals for DK Metcalf?
So I think there's a couple of layers to this, right? First of all, I was just looking at positional spending this morning and just kind of, that's what I do in my free time is look at stuff like that.
Nerd.
The Seahawks are paying more money to wide receivers than any team in the league. They're number one right now. It's like $70 million committed to their wide receiver group. So I think that part of the discussion to try and balance some of that out is Tyler Lockett. You can kind of correct some of that. And I think that helps put into perspective the idea that, if there are those who want us to trade or move on from DK Metcalf just because they don't think he's worth whatever money he's going to command on this extension, that's pretty much all we'd be paying to that wide receiver group. JSN still on a rookie contract for the next 2 to 5 years or 2 to 3 years. I'm in the camp of you do everything you can to keep your good players. And I think those who are sort of in favor of trading DK Metcalf focus more on what he can't do. And the fact that he's not a perfect receiver, the fact that he's not as complete of a receiver in his skill set as some of these other guys that are making that money in the top 5. And that's a valid argument. But what he can do and what he does give you on the field is so difficult that there's a reason that JSN caught 100 balls this year. And one of those reasons is that even through week 18, when, those last 5-6 of the weeks of the year, really after the injury, when he came back, DK wasn't as impactful in the box score as he was earlier in the season. He was still drawing double teams. He was still the guy drawing extra coverage from the safeties and teams are rotating to him. He's still that kind of a weapon. Now, what Mike Macdonald kind of verbalized that he was frustrated by at the end of the year is that, in fact, he even said it, I think after the Vikings game, maybe he said he can't just be a decoy. Like, we also need to get the ball to him, even though he's serving a positive role for us in that aspect. And so I'm in the camp of you keep DK. The players love him. Like that position group, like they all look to him. He's their alpha. He's their leader. And he gives you a presence on the field that you feel. And I still think he's a guy, and I know we keep saying this about a couple of different players. I don't know that he's fully been unlocked yet. I don't know that we've had a play caller yet that understands how to get the most out of DK Metcalf. Felt like we scratched the surface early last season, and then we kind of lost our way.
I don't know, Dan. I mean, what are we going to do with those 5 to 6 penalties that he gets every single year? That's just,
he got
too much
one this year, didn't he? He got one, right?
Well, I mean, there were also some holding penalties, if I'm counting all 6. But
show me who he led the league in one-handed neck blocks.
Yeah,
right.
Sure did. Sure did.
I love DK, and
I do too.
I hope there's a way for him to stick around. I will say this. I don't think any player is off limits for the most part for the right deal. And in a year that's generally considered to be a little bit of a down year compared to the last 3 or 4 in the draft, as far as wide receiver talent coming out, especially in that mold, most of the receivers in this group outside of Ted McMillan at the top are slot guys, sub 6 foot guys, a little bit different style. So if there is a team out there that wants an alpha to add to their receiver room and doesn't feel like they're going to get it in the draft or free agency, if someone calls and offers enough, they might put John in a position where he has to figure out what he's going to do. I just think the people that want to trade DK need to also understand Tyler Lockett's not going to be on this roster next year. And so now you're replacing both those guys. And that's a daunting task given the other needs that they need to address too.
Yeah, so when you're talking about that $70 million, it's like a $30 million cap hit for Tyler. And that's not a realistic number. And it just seems obvious that they'd move on from that. If you extend DK, that brings that cap number down too. So as high as it looks when we're all looking at the salary cap going into the offseason, that is the most manageable part of the team.
Yeah.
The quarterback spot, also a high cap number. Dan, it sounds like you are kind of in the camp where I've found myself with Geno Smith, in that you look at that $46 million cap number and you go, ooh, I think that's a little too high. Like, I love Geno and some of the things that he can do, but there comes a point to where you say, that number's a little bit high. Is there something the Seahawks can do? And there was one aspect of that you came up with on one of your recent shows.
Yeah, it's interesting. As we step away from the emotion of the season, my thought process on this becomes a lot more objective. I think when I get into the offseason, it becomes a lot more wide angle view. Like, what's the best thing to do, as opposed to just what I want to see happen or what I would like to do. And all along, we've talked about the different options with Geno, and one of them has always been, well, you can just let him play out the last year of his deal, right? And then go from there. There's no way. I've crossed that one off the whiteboard. Like, there's no way he plays on that number in 2025. And so, I did a show a couple weeks ago kind of outlining all the options. And one that I didn't think about at the time, but I think has some merit to it is, look, we know how John Schneider operates when it comes to impending free agents. We've seen it a bunch of times. They determine what they believe that player is worth financially. They present that to the player, and then they don't budge much. They don't play around. They're not like that car salesman that gives you the artificially inflated number, right, and sends you out and then keeps going back and forth with his sales manager, right, trying to get you down to that number that you can handle, which is still probably higher than it needs to be. He doesn't operate that way. He's very upfront and transparent. I think players respect that. Here's what you're worth. He probably doesn't use those terms. Here's what we're willing to give you. We want you here under this circumstance. And if he, wants to play hardball, he thinks he's worth more, he thinks he's a top 10 quarterback, he told Richard Sherman that, okay, well, then he may give him permission to shop, right? And a lot of those conversations kind of happen sort of unofficially anyway, especially around the combine. It could come to a point where he just says, okay, well, we're going to release you because we got to get your money off the books, but we want you back at this number. You know what we're offering. Go test the market. If you find a starting job and the money you want, God bless you, and we'll figure out what we're going to do from here. If you don't, we'd love to have you back at this number. They've done it with other free agents. We've seen free agents test the market and come back. I mean, all the way back to, I remember freaking out about Red Bryant hitting free agency one year, and he went and tested it, came back. I think Rocky Bernard did as well. I think Brandon Mebane did it once as well. So maybe it's a defensive lineman thing, because Leonard Williams did for about 8 hours last year too. But just that concept that, like, we aren't beholden to what Geno wants. He's not really at a position in his career to dictate any terms. And so as much as I do think there are teams that would be interested in him and he would have a market, I don't think anyone out there is going to pay anything near what his cap hit would be with us this year. So if it comes to that, that's an option on the list.
Which means that they really do have to make a decision then by the time that his bonuses kick in, right?
It is
in
like
March,
middle of March, right? March 16th, something
start
like that.
of NFL free agency.
Yeah.
Do you think that they would then
Which is
have to
pretty
make?
soon.
Yeah, no, it happens fast. Like you go Senior Bowl,
Oh, I know.
Combine, boom, there we are.
Yeah, we're 2 months away
Right.
already.
Yeah.
Do you think that they would need to make a move at quarterback then before that, as far as a contingency plan, whether it's trading for somebody, whether it's just maybe setting something up for the start of free agency? What do you think?
I wish I had a really smart answer for this, but I
Hmm.
don't know because I don't know how they really feel about Sam Howell.
Yeah.
You know, when that deal was made last year, I was all for it. I liked his college tape. I liked some of the stuff he put on tape with the Commanders last year, even though he was kind of the way Bieniemy ran that offense did him no favors and kind of just left him out there to dry. And he had a lot of qualities I like in a quarterback, and I thought that was a really shrewd shot at a guy that could end up being a solid starter in this league, even, you know, at least as a bridge guy. And then he went out, and one of the biggest stories of training camp was how much he stunk it up in practices for the most part. But I thought he looked really good in the games. And, you know, then we talk about the second half of the Green Bay game when he had to come in. People have put so much weight onto that. There are people that have written him off just because of those 17 plays. And I don't think that's fair under any circumstances for any player. It was not a winnable situation that they put him in there and then called 12 straight pass plays. That was crazy. So he still might be an option. I just don't know. You know, if they like him well enough, and a lot of this has to do with the coordinator hire, right? If Clint Kubiak thinks that he can manage an offense, remember, a Kyle Shanahan offense that made a superstar out of a 7th round, a Mr. Irrelevant who nobody even heard of when he was drafted. Most people, unless you're nerds like me and saw him play against your Washington State Cougs in the Alamo Bowl as a freshman, then, you know, that's an example of a guy that doesn't have elite skills, elite traits, wasn't a top draft pick that they could win with. That, you know, maybe he is the contingency plan still. We just have no idea. We don't know. They haven't talked about him, and reporters don't ever get to see him run reps.
Guys, I want to present one scenario that I think might be the best, like the Goldilocks zone scenario, right? And that is to extend Geno, to extend DK, and let's say your 2025 cap hit for those two players is about $35 million.
I think that's probably the most realistic option right now. Like, I think that's if I was
That's a good
betting
option
on what the most likely outcome of all this is, I think both those players get extended. Their cap hits get reduced significantly. We have a cap manager now. He's been there for a full year that has apparently convinced John Schneider that void years are okay. They've done it with a couple of players now. And that's a really, really good way to lower initial cap hits. It catches up to you later on, but then you manage it then. And I think that's the most likely outcome. As much as sometimes I try to imagine John sitting in his office looking at the whiteboard and all the numbers and thinking, we just have to go cheaper at quarterback and figure out a way and find a guy. I don't think, I think he's a little more risk averse than that. And I think the edict he's been given from ownership to stay competitive and not rebuild, I think both those guys are on the roster at a lower number.
Yeah, that seems like the most likely option, especially if you want to maintain a competitive team moving forward.
Yeah.
I just think that you would want to have some kind of backup plan in case that plan of releasing Geno backfires a little bit and there's another team that goes, oh, hey, yeah, we'll pay you. Because we've seen some teams do some crazy things like the Cleveland Browns, although they're under such cap stress now with Deshaun Watson that they couldn't talk their way into the Geno point at this. So he might be saved in that regard.
Yeah.
I want to go back though, because you mentioned Clint Kubiak. You know, they made Brock Purdy look really good. Does that detract then from that idea that, well, they had all these injuries down in New Orleans, and I feel like we look at those first two games with Clint Kubiak and go, oh man, they just blew out the Panthers. They blew out the Cowboys. They were fully healthy, and then they kind of got hit by injuries. Does it detract at all that maybe he couldn't get more out of Spencer Rattler, or do you think he got as much as possible out of Rattler in that Saints offense?
I think the second part of that. Yeah. I memean, it was only a year ago that Seahawks fans were blowing me up, telling me about Spencer Rattler and how they should draft him on the second day and how he's going to, and yeah, I never got on board with that. I mean, he's a guy that has limitations and was thrown into the fire with, like, I think two-fifths of his offensive line were out at that point. Kamara got hurt down the stretch. Their wide receiver group is such that, Valdez Scantling comes off the street and leads them in touchdowns the second half of the season. Like, there were issues there, and that's tough for a coordinator. But I think it really does bring up the point, or amplify the point that, like, how do you weight someone's experience, right? Because it's so easy. It's just human nature to look at someone's resume and go, well, man, you've got all these skills, you've got all these traits, you've got a great track record, you've worked for some great people, but I didn't like what you did there for about 6 weeks that one time, versus someone who's never done it. And can you get sucked into the allure of what could be there sometimes without any track record? That's tricky. And that's why those guys get paid what they get paid to run football teams and make these decisions, because they're not cut and dried.
Well, Dan, you have the Pick is In podcast, and you're going to be looking at the draft through this offseason. You're going to be going to the Senior Bowl here in the next couple weeks. I'm a little bit curious of what you have planned coming up here for the draft season.
Lots and lots of draft talk. Yeah. So my own personal show, Seahawks Forever, sometime by the end of February, let's say, I'm going to switch to a daily format Monday through Friday, and we'll do those shows live. And I'm trying to pick a time spot, so I'm not competing with some of the other great creators that are out there that do live stuff every day. I just feel like that's the format that I want to go with, and primarily because I love the engagement and with the fans, and the being able to get the questions and the comments and the interaction, and some of that conversation flow. And then the Pick is In is something I'm really excited about. It's a concept that I've been kicking around for quite a while, to do content outside of the Seahawks world and be able to talk drafts league wide, which is it's one of my obsessions. It's an addiction. It's a problem. But it's one I don't look to kick anytime soon. And then Bryce, who I've become such good friends with over the last year, doing stuff together with his podcast with Ryan McMillan over on the Hawk Zone Rundown. I know you guys know those guys, and he came to me with the idea. And so it's called The Pick is In. The channel has begun. Get over there and be one of the subscribers. I think it's down here below. You can see it's at The Pick is In Pod on Twitter and YouTube. And we did our first episode last weekend. We did a full first round NFL wide mock draft. We're going to do our second show live tomorrow night, where we're going to start focusing on this quarterback class. It just gives us a lot more freedom to talk about teams and concepts and players that you don't get to talk about if you only focus on the Seahawks, because then you're beholden only to the Seahawks draft picks, right? And so we're going to get into each division and some of the team needs and things like that. So really excited about that, and cannot express enough how excited I am to go to the Senior Bowl, an event I've been watching for 4 decades, and is the premier event of the draft season, I think. And they're calling it the best class ever, potentially, at the Senior Bowl. Tons and tons of talent. Some of those guys, well, I was going to say some of those guys are going to be Seahawks, but I'll flip it around and say this. Most of the players that the Seahawks draft on draft days are playing in this game. I think Michael Giroux is the only player that didn't play in the Senior Bowl the Seahawks drafted last year. So we'll be seeing some future Seahawks while I'm down there.
And I do want to ask, maybe as we start to close out this episode too, just some early draft crushes, draft names that are out there, and maybe just some positions that you think, let's flip it back to our Seahawks, positions you think we could go for, should go for, maybe are under the radar positions we ought to go for, and maybe pairing that with a draft crusher too that you like, hey, check out this name. Like when we get to see Shrine Bowl highlights and Senior Bowl highlights, and we get to see them run around in their underwear at the combine, who are a couple of dudes that are already kind of catching your eye?
There are a few. I'll answer those in reverse order. Couple of my crushes, obviously focusing pretty heavy on offensive linemen, trying to see what's going on in the trenches there. That's where my focus has been to begin with. And then I'll kind of branch out, move over to the defensive side of the ball. And I try not to put too much emotional stock in guys that I don't think are going to be available to the Seahawks. But at this point, it's so far out, you really don't know. Will Campbell's one. Offensive tackle, left tackle out of LSU. Most scouts think he's going to end up moving inside to guard once his arms are measured, right? But I don't know if you guys saw the interview with him a couple of weeks ago, but that's where the crush really accelerated when he was talking. He had He had that quote. He's got that Southern drawl. Like he just seems like a lineman, right? Like a guy that just wants to bury you in the turf. And he had that quote about, if you're a defensive end, you get 1 sack a game, you're a top 5 draft pick. But if you're an offensive tackle, you give up 1 sack a game, you don't get drafted. He's a draft crush. I've got a couple of other guys later. I'm a big fan of Jake Majors, the center at Texas. He's played a ton of football, kind of old school throwback. Not sure how his athletic testing is going to be, but he looks like a guy that could step in almost right away. Might be a little bit better today than Oluwatimi long term. Although I'm pleased with Oluwatimi's performance over the year. Jack Sawyer's a guy that I think will be available at 18. And maybe 18 is a little rich for him, but he seems to be moving up boards. He's a guy that I wanted to come out last year, and he didn't. He just, not just from a need standpoint, because I think especially if this team moves on from Draymond Jones, we need another edge. This guy can set the edge. He can get after the quarterback. Obviously, he can make an impact on a game. You saw how the semifinal game ended, right, against Texas. But he's just, fiery, blue collar, lunch pail carrying dude that you want on your team. I think he's kind of a culture setting type of guy. Tyler Booker is another name that Seahawks fans are already familiar with. 18 might be a little high for a true guard that can't play tackle, but he just embodies, I think, everything that Laken Tomlinson wasn't at that spot and that we need at that spot. He's just big and physical. He's a mauler. He's very, very good in pass protection too. He's got that combination. I think he's a guy that, even if the experts say he's a reach, if we take him at 18, I don't think anyone here in Seattle is going to complain about. And then to kind of combine the two questions, I think some of this has to do with who the coordinator is, right? And if we go back and we, revisit some of the stuff we talked about 10 minutes ago, if Clint Kubiak's the choice and he likes to go a lot of 12 and 13 personnel, how do you feel about that tight end group that we have? Do you think it's good enough? Right?
Not yet. No.
Noah Fant with an $8 million cap hit coming up this year. You got to address that. Maybe he's a guy Kubiak will like, and that's another guy you can extend, right? And lower that cap hit. Brady Russell couldn't stay healthy. We liked what we saw to AJ Barner as a rookie. Pharaoh Brown was on a 1-year deal. So tight end's a need. And there's a couple really, really good ones that may be available at 18, although I think this guy is going to end up probably being sniped a little bit before that. But Tyler Warren out of Penn State, I think has all pro written all over him. Mm-hmm. I think he's a guy that makes an impact for you day one. And I think he's a guy that you can almost include in that wide receiver group, even if now that's a guy like if you do trade DK Metcalf and you feel like there's a big void there at wide receiver, that void doesn't always have to be filled by someone else that has wide receiver as their position title. Tyler Warren's a two-way player. He's gotten comps to George Kittle. I think he can be better than that. I think he might end up being a better overall tight end even than Brock Bowers, who just, finished out a historically good rookie season. I think Warren's a phenomenal player, which is probably why he won't be there at 18.
There's one thing you said that I thought was kind of cute, Dan, that you thought John Schneider might reach for a guard at 18. That's
I think league-wide, generally, when it comes to positional value, interior offensive linemen who can only be interior offensive linemen typically don't go in the top 20. It's just, we saw it last year, even guys like Grant Barton and some of those guys that we liked, and Zach Frazier, they kind of fell down the board, whereas at certain points they might have been mocked a little bit higher. So now, all that being said, I am of the opinion that the offensive line issue is going to be addressed before the draft starts. We're not going to go into the draft with gaping holes, and left guard's not going to be vacant by the time we get to the draft. I'll be shocked if that's the case. And so I try to tell people that as we're having these discussions about the draft that, I see all these fans doing mock drafts and it's tackle, guard, center, first 3 picks. Like, that's not how it's going to go down. Yeah. You've invested a lot of draft capital the last 3-4 years on young players. There's a lot of young talent on that line. There's some pieces there. You're not just going to build it all through the draft when you have other needs. John Schneider, if, and I believe when, he addresses that line properly and fixes it this offseason, it's going to be done through free agency or potentially a trade, but he's not just going to sit back and wait for the draft to address it.
And that's generally, I feel like, even though, we give him a hard time about interior offensive line, because frankly, he deserves it. He generally does a good job of addressing areas of need ahead of the draft, and so that they go into the draft with not having any huge glaring holes, and that way you can kind of and I think John Schneider does his best then when he isn't trying to pick for any type of need.
Let me address that for a second, because I think it's something that has been a big storyline the last month or so. You know, fans really like to pile on to Schneider and how he's failed and his philosophy doesn't work on the offensive line. There's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to build a good offensive line. You can have the Detroit Lions line, where I think 4 of the 5 starters are first-round draft picks.
And I think the 3rd round pick is the 5th one.
But that was built through primarily, some of those picks were because they just stunk for years, and they're drafting at the top of the draft. You're getting a shot at guys like Taylor Decker and Penei Sewell. You're getting those. If the Seahawks have been drafting in the top 5 for the last 10 years, and they follow their board and go best player available, I guarantee you they would have had more first-round picks on their offensive line. We saw that when they had the 9th pick. They took Charles Cross because he was the best player. I think that it's gotten twisted a little bit. I don't think the philosophy is all that flawed. Look at the Green Bay Packers line. There are other good offensive lines out there that don't have any first-round picks. I think the Packers are 2 seconds, a third, a sixth, and a 7th, and they're all on their rookie deals. Like, you can do it that way. It's the evaluation they've missed. It's the players that they have signed and drafted that haven't quite worked out the way that they had hoped. The philosophy can work. It just has a wider margin for error, and you have to be almost perfect on the guys that you pick to find that value. So I think this is the year we see that corrected, and they go for more of a known quantity and try to pursue a really solid veteran or 2 in free agency to fix that, because I think the head coach is going to demand it.
Well, I think what's sticking in people's craw right now is, it's very recent and it still hurts, is the Christian Haynes pick from this year, right? So you have a 3rd rounder who very vastly underperformed. Does not mean that he can't be a really successful guard in the NFL, get stronger, whatever it is that he has to go do, that they think he has to go do, that by mid year 2 into year 3, it's actually quite a good guard. That is a absolutely possible outcome. But there were a lot of players drafted after Christian Haynes who put in a lot of good reps this year and a lot of starting games this year. So that becomes but that's one of them. But I agree with you that it's like, but there's also some guards that are going to be available right in free agency where it's like, okay, open the pocketbook, whether that's the highest end or you find someone that's at least good, and you get one of those 2 guard positions more secure before the draft hits. And I think that's the move. I think it's what you were alluding to as well. But we're excited to keep chatting with you, man. And hopefully, Brandon, what do you think? After you go to the Shrine Bowl and Dan goes over to the Senior Bowl, maybe it could be like a Rice-A-Roni commercial, like you guys get together and have 2 dinners. What do you think?
There we go. Yeah, I think that's a good plan, and share a few notes of what we see at each location.
Absolutely.
And,
I feel like, and we'll do that on the new channel. Yeah, we'll Bryce and I will have you on. The pick is in, and we'll kind of compare some notes on some of our favorite prospects and sleepers and guys that stood out, guys that disappointed us. And because, man, Eric Galco's done such a great job with that Shrine game. That game had fallen off. There was a time, in my lifetime when I was younger, where they were both kind of on equal footing, and I looked forward to both of them, and they staggered them. So one was always one week and one was the next week. And then the Shrine game really fell off and became kind of irrelevant there for a while. But he's built that up. Some of the prospects are choosing the Shrine game now over the Senior Bowl, and there's a lot of talent there. So, yeah, I can't wait to hear your thoughts on what you see there, and I'll share mine, that what I see in Mobile. We can compare some food experiences, and maybe I'll get some good barbecue while I'm down there. I don't know. Is that a thing in Alabama? Right? Yeah. Right?
It's been so long since I've been to Alabama, I don't even know. But Dallas, that's why it was a little more appealing, because it was a little bit easier to get to, and plus, it's I've never actually seen a game in that Texas Stadium of Jerry's. So
that's got to be cool. I have a 3-hour layover on Sunday in Dallas. Maybe I'll just shoot over and
shoot on over,
do a quick interview with somebody, and then.
He's Dan Viens of Seahawks Forever and the Pick is In podcast. And Dan, I would even throw out an invite to you. We're going to be doing a hate watch party here on Sunday. We're going to be watching the Eagles and the Rams. Open invite. I know you might be busy, but just to throw that out there, we're going to be hanging out and watching the stupid Rams and hoping that they fail, because That's just what we do in the off season. And when our Seahawks aren't in it, our new favorite team is whoever plays a team in the NFC West.
I'll tell you what, I'll try to find time to jump in there. I got an apartment to pack up over the next couple of weeks. And so I'll be doing some of that with the TV on in the background, but I'll try to take a break and pop in, cause that'll be fun. Cause that Rams team, how quickly they turn that around on defense and fix that in light of Aaron Donald's departure.
Annoying.
I was a little bit annoyed and scared with the draft because they took so many dudes that I loved throughout the process. And they pretty much hit on all those guys. And by the end of the year, they look like a group that you didn't want any part of. And I'm a little ticked off about that. Yeah.
So they just need to lose. So the way they can stop annoying us.
Right.
Yeah. And last thing I'll say for you, Dan is like, this is the last opportunity for the hate watch, because we did a Cardinals party, and that didn't go, though. That went off a helmet, and we lost that game with the untimely interception. Yeah. We did one last game where they dismantled the Vikings. So we said to ourselves, this is our last go, boys. This is our last hate watch. If they happen to also win this game, well, then it's an us problem. We're out. So we're hoping you come, we could be that little concession TV. It all comes together, Dan. And then you watch it there. You help cheer it on as you're packing your boxes, hop in for a quick minute, and we could watch these stupid Rams go down in flames. It's got to happen.
2 minutes left. Rams driving to win it. Matt Stafford in the huddle going, come on, guys, let's show those Seahawkers. Let's show them.
That's it.
And I think with that,
there's only one thing left to say.
Go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Go Hawks.